Imagine sitting in a courtroom being mocked by a judge, but then in a twist of fate, it's the judge who ends up in trouble instead. What would you do if you were the one laughing one minute and needing help the next? This story will make you think about fairness, respect, and how quickly life can change. Every day, in courts across the country, people stand before judges hoping for fairness. But what happens when a judge lets her arrogance get the best of her? Today, we're going to tell you the story of a black man who faced mockery from a judge but ended up turning the tables in a way that no one could have predicted. This story is all about fairness, respect, and the surprising consequences when justice is ignored. The man at the center of this story is Marcus Green, a 32-year-old schoolteacher who has spent most of his life in his hometown of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Marcus is a soft-spoken, respectful man who has a deep love for teaching. He's the kind of person who truly cares about his students, always going above and beyond to make sure they understand the lessons he teaches and also helping them in any way he can outside of school. His calm demeanor and kind nature have made him well liked by the children and parents at his school. Marcus's life hasn't been easy. Growing up in a neighborhood that was known for its struggles, he always worked hard to make a better life for himself. He had to overcome many obstacles, from financial difficulties to dealing with prejudice. Yet despite these challenges, Marcus always stayed focused on his goal to become a teacher and give back to his community. He was proud of his career, but he never imagined he would find himself in a courtroom. It all started when Marcus was accused of something he didn't do. A false claim had been made against him by a former colleague, and now he was facing charges that could ruin his career. Marcus had faith in the legal system, though, and he hoped the truth would eventually come out. But nothing prepared him for what he was about to face in court. On the other side of the courtroom was Judge Olivia Taylor, a 48-year-old woman known for her tough and unyielding demeanor. With over 20 years of experience on the bench, Judge Taylor was respected by many for her sharp mind and her reputation for following the law strictly, without exceptions. However, there were whispers about her strictness and the way she sometimes treated people who weren't from her social circle. Some believed she was out of touch with the struggles of the everyday person and that she lacked empathy, especially for people of color. Still, she was known to be efficient and fair, at least on the surface. Judge Taylor had a reputation for being intimidating in the courtroom. Her strong posture and sharp, commanding voice made it clear that she expected to be respected. Her decisions were often final, and she wasn't one to tolerate any disrespect. However, those who knew her outside the courtroom saw a different side to her. She was well connected in the legal community, and many admired her for her intelligence and career accomplishments. Yet there were always those who questioned how much she understood the struggles of people who didn't have the privilege she had enjoyed throughout her life. Her appearance in the courtroom was always immaculate. Her robes were always perfectly pressed, her glasses perched elegantly on the bridge of her nose, and her makeup flawless. But despite her polished appearance, there was something about her that made some people uneasy. It wasn't just her. As Marcus sat in the defendant's seat, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation on his shoulders. He had never been in a courtroom before, and now his future seemed uncertain. His hands were shaking slightly, but he tried to stay calm, knowing that he had done nothing wrong. However, the moment he walked in and saw Judge Taylor, he could feel the tension in the air. Her cold stare sent a chill down his spine. She hadn't even acknowledged him yet, and already he could tell she wasn't going to be on his side. What Marcus didn't know was that Judge Taylor had already made up her mind about him. She had already judged him based on his appearance, his background, and her own biases. She had no idea who he really was or the kind of man he had grown to become. And, unfortunately for Marcus, the courtroom would soon become a battleground where his dignity and sense of justice would be tested in ways he hadn't expected. As the trial began, the tension in the room started to build. Judge Taylor's sharp questions and dismissive tone set the stage for what was to come. She mocked Marcus's answers, chuckling when he gave straightforward responses, showing a complete lack of empathy for his situation. The more she mocked him, the more Marcus felt like he was losing control of the situation. But little did she know the scales of justice were about to tip in a way no one could have predicted. The courtroom where Marcus found himself was big, but not overwhelmingly so. The tall wooden walls gave it a formal, almost intimidating feel. At the front, a large wooden bench stood raised above the rest of the room. It was polished, smooth, and imposing, making it clear who held the power in the room. Behind the bench, the judge's chair was even more noticeable. It was a high-backed chair that seemed to command respect, upholstered in a dark, rich leather. On either side of the judge's bench were flags, one American, the other the state flag, each standing at attention, just like the people who worked in the courtroom. The rows of seats were arranged neatly in front of the bench, where the public could sit and watch. Today there weren't many people in the audience, just a few witnesses and reporters who were there for other cases. Marcus could hear the soft murmur of people whispering to each other, but the moment the gavel hit the desk, everything fell silent. The air in the room felt heavy, almost thick with tension. All eyes were on him. His lawyer sat beside him, a middle-aged man named Mr. Adams. Mr. Adams was an experienced attorney, but even he seemed nervous in front of Judge Taylor. He kept his head down, his voice barely audible, as he whispered to Marcus, giving him reassurance. On the other side, the prosecutor sat at his table, a woman with a stern expression. She didn't seem to care much about who Marcus was or whether he was innocent. She was just doing her job, pushing the case forward with no real care for the man she was accusing. Marcus could feel his heart race as he waited for the trial to begin. The room felt colder the longer he sat there, waiting for the judge to speak. Judge Taylor, sitting high above them, was the center of attention. Her black robe flowed down around her like a dark cloud. As she looked down at the room, her sharp, piercing eyes scanned everyone before resting on Marcus. Without a word, she adjusted her glasses and called the courtroom to order. The sound of the gavel hitting the desk echoed through the silence. There was no room for mistakes in this space, and Marcus knew that he had to be on his best behavior, even if the judge didn't seem to care about his feelings. The courtroom was quiet now, the atmosphere serious. Everything was formal, with everyone knowing their place. The tension was building as the trial began. Marcus Green was in court because of a false accusation made against him by his former colleague, Susan Hall. Susan was a teacher at the same school where Marcus had been working for several years. The two of them had never been particularly close, but there was no animosity between them. That all changed when Susan filed a complaint against Marcus, accusing him of something that never happened. She claimed that Marcus had acted inappropriately towards her during a school event a few months earlier. According to Susan, Marcus had made an unwelcome comment and then followed her into a hallway, making her feel uncomfortable. However, Marcus had no recollection of the event she described. He was sure that he had not done anything wrong and that this was all a misunderstanding. Susan's accusation was serious, especially for a teacher. If found guilty, Marcus could lose his job and his reputation. More than that, he feared the damage it could do to his career, his future, and his life. He had spent years building a career as an educator, and to see it all crumble because of a lie was devastating. Marcus knew he had to fight the accusation. He had hired a lawyer and was determined to clear his name. But in the courtroom, it wasn't just his innocence that was being tested. The trial would also reveal how the justice system treated people like him, a black man from a working-class background, and how much the color of his skin would play into the way he was judged. From the start, things didn't look good. The prosecutor wasted no time presenting Susan's story. She described the incident in detail, painting Marcus in a light that made him seem like a predator. She spoke with certainty, and the audience in the courtroom listened intently, nodding as though they believed every word. Then it was Marcus's turn to speak. As his lawyer stood up to begin his defense, Marcus felt a mix of nerves and frustration. He knew he had to stay calm, but he could feel the judgment in the air, especially coming from Judge Taylor. He tried to keep his voice steady as he explained his side of the story, but it was difficult when the judge kept interrupting him with sharp, cutting questions. "I'm not sure I understand, Mr. Green," Judge Taylor said with an air of superiority. "You expect us to believe that this accusation is all a misunderstanding? How convenient for you." Marcus felt his chest tighten. He wasn't used to being questioned like this, and the judge's mocking tone made him feel smaller than he already did. His lawyer stood beside him, trying to defend him, but the judge's dismissive attitude made it clear that she wasn't interested in hearing much from him. "I'm just asking for fairness, Your Honor," Marcus said quietly. "I never did what she's accusing me of. I want the truth to come out." Judge Taylor didn't respond right away. She leaned back in her chair, eyeing Marcus as if she were trying to decide whether he was worth her time. She didn't seem interested in hearing his explanation, and that's when Marcus began to realize how hard this was going to be. Not just to prove his innocence, but to be treated with respect by the very person who was supposed to make sure justice was served. Little did anyone know, though, that the situation in that courtroom was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would show everyone just how quickly things could change when someone thought they had all the power. As the trial progressed, Marcus could feel the weight of the judge's scrutiny bearing down on him. Every word he spoke was met with a cold, calculating gaze from Judge Taylor. She hadn't made up her mind yet, but it was clear she wasn't going to make it easy for him. Marcus tried his best to stay calm, even though he could feel the tension rising in his chest. Then it happened. Marcus had just finished explaining how he had been in a different part of the school at the time of the alleged incident, and that there were several witnesses who could vouch for his whereabouts. He spoke in a clear, calm voice, hoping that the judge would listen to the facts, but Judge Taylor didn't seem to care about the facts. She leaned forward slightly, her lips curling into a slight smirk as she looked down at him. "How convenient, Mr. Green," she said, in a tone that dripped with sarcasm. "You expect us to believe that the one person who's accused of something so serious just happens to have a perfect alibi? A little too perfect, don't you think?" There was a slight chuckle in her voice as she spoke, and the room fell silent, almost as if everyone was waiting for her to deliver some sort of punchline. The judge seemed to think it was amusing, like she had just heard a story from a child that was too far-fetched to be true. She leaned back in her chair, looking over at the prosecutor, as if sharing a private joke. For a moment, Marcus was stunned. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The judge, who was supposed to be impartial, was laughing at him, questioning the sincerity of his words as if his explanation was nothing more than a silly excuse. The laugh wasn't loud, but it was cutting. It was the kind of laugh that made you feel small, like you were being dismissed before you even had a chance to prove yourself. Marcus's face flushed with embarrassment. He could feel the heat rising in his cheeks and his stomach twisted. He had been prepared for tough questions, for skepticism, but not for mockery, not from the person who was supposed to be the voice of fairness in this room. For a second, Marcus felt like he might lose his composure. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, his nails digging into his palms. His mind raced, thinking about how badly he wanted to stand up and defend himself, to shout at the judge for laughing at him like that. But then he took a slow, deep breath. He had come too far to let his emotions control him now. He knew he had to stay calm. The last thing he wanted to do was feed into the judge's mocking attitude. He had learned a long time ago that reacting in anger wouldn't get him anywhere. So instead of responding with frustration, he looked up at Judge Taylor, his eyes steady but calm. "I understand that you might find my explanation difficult to believe, Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice low but firm. "But I assure you it's the truth. I was nowhere near the area where this incident supposedly took place. And I have witnesses to prove it." His words were measured, controlled. He refused to let the judge's laughter shake him, even though inside it stung. He could feel the eyes of the courtroom on him, some people watching curiously, others with judgment. But he didn't look away. He kept his gaze focused on the judge, his expression resolute. Judge Taylor seemed to pause for a moment, as if she hadn't expected him to respond so calmly. Her smirk faded slightly, but she quickly regained her composure and gave a small nod. "Very well, Mr. Green," she said, her tone now a bit more formal, but still with a hint of skepticism. "We will see what the witnesses have to say, but don't think for one moment that your story is the end of this matter." Marcus didn't respond, but his heart was still pounding in his chest. He was shaken, but he refused to let it show. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to let anyone, not even the judge, take his dignity away from him. As the trial continued, Marcus focused on the facts and his testimony. He knew he had to stick to the truth. He wasn't there to impress anyone, but to clear his name. Judge Taylor's laugh had rattled him, but it also reminded him why he was there. This wasn't about her or anyone else in that courtroom. This was about proving that he had been falsely accused and that he deserved to be treated fairly. But deep down, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the judge had already made up her mind. Even if the evidence pointed in his favor, he could see that her perception of him was clouded by biases he couldn't control. Yet, he wasn't going to let that stop him. He would fight with everything he had to make sure the truth was heard. Despite the mocking laugh, Marcus found a sense of strength in that moment. The judge's dismissive behavior only fueled his determination. If she thought he was just going to fold, she was wrong. He wouldn't let her mockery define him. This was his chance to show the world who he really was, someone who wouldn't back down no matter how unfair things seemed. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Marcus was ready. And no matter how many times Judge Taylor laughed or questioned him, he was going to keep his head high and stay focused on the truth. As the trial dragged on, the tension in the courtroom seemed to increase with each passing moment. Marcus had remained composed, but it was becoming more and more clear that Judge Taylor wasn't going to make it easy for him. She had questioned every piece of evidence and dismissed the witnesses Marcus had brought forward, pointing out minor inconsistencies with a sharp tongue. Her attitude had become more condescending, almost as if she were enjoying the power she held in the room. Every time Marcus spoke, it felt like she was just waiting for him to make a mistake. Then something unexpected happened. It wasn't a grand moment, no sudden explosion of emotion or dramatic gesture, but rather a quiet, unassuming event that would change everything. A piece of evidence, which had been overlooked earlier, was introduced by Marcus's lawyer. It was a piece of security footage from the school taken from cameras that covered the hallways near where the alleged incident had supposedly occurred. Marcus's lawyer had been working behind the scenes to obtain this footage, knowing that it could be crucial in disproving the false accusation. The footage clearly showed Marcus in a completely different part of the building during the time the incident supposedly took place, walking with several colleagues toward the teacher's lounge. Judge Taylor, who had been so sure of Marcus's guilt earlier, watched the footage intently, her expression unreadable at first. As the video played, the camera focused on Marcus's figure, and the timestamp clearly matched the time of the alleged incident. There was no denying it. Marcus was exactly where he said he was. At first, Judge Taylor didn't react. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she leaned forward, eyes narrowing as if trying to find something wrong with the footage. But there was nothing. The footage didn't lie. Marcus sat there, heart pounding in his chest, as he waited for the judge's response. He had been sure that the video would clear his name, but seeing it play out in front of everyone in the courtroom made it feel more real. His lawyer turned to him with a small, reassuring smile, while the prosecutor remained quiet, clearly caught off guard by the unexpected evidence. And then came the moment that no one in the room had expected. Judge Taylor's face, so composed and confident just moments before, now betrayed something she hadn't allowed anyone to see. For the briefest of moments, her expression faltered, her eyes widened slightly and her shoulders tensed. It was subtle, but it was enough to show that something had shifted. She was no longer the confident, authoritative figure who had mocked Marcus earlier. Now she was the one who seemed unsure, even a little rattled. The room went completely still as the footage ended. Everyone waited for the judge to speak, but she didn't say anything immediately. For a few moments, it felt as though the entire courtroom held its breath. Finally, Judge Taylor cleared her throat and shifted in her seat. "This footage," she began, her voice now lacking the sharp edge it had held before, "appears to corroborate Mr. Green's statement." She paused, her eyes quickly scanning the courtroom. "But I would advise caution in drawing any conclusions just yet. We will need to examine further." But there was no hiding it now. The footage was a game-changer. It had given Marcus a strong defense, and it exposed the flaws in the judge's earlier judgment. She had been so quick to mock him, so certain of his guilt, that she hadn't even considered looking at all the evidence with an open mind. Now, she was caught in her own mistake. The room was silent for a moment longer, and then Marcus could feel it, a shift in the air. The power dynamics had changed. No longer was he the one on trial. Now it was the judge who was under scrutiny. The prosecutor seemed flustered, and the defense attorney appeared relieved, nodding toward Marcus. But Judge Taylor, who had always maintained control, now looked uncharacteristically uneasy. Her face was flushed, her confidence gone, replaced with the uncomfortable realization that her own judgment had been flawed. The same woman who had mocked Marcus for his calm demeanor, who had laughed at him earlier, was now sitting there, visibly shaken by the evidence. The once assertive judge had been put in a position where she had to confront her own biases. For the first time in the trial, she appeared vulnerable. It was as though the veil of authority had been ripped away, leaving her exposed. Judge Taylor knew deep down that she had made a mistake. Her entire approach to the case had been clouded by her initial judgment of Marcus. She had let her personal biases influence her actions, dismissing him without truly considering the evidence. And now, with the video in front of everyone, there was no denying it. She quickly tried to regain her composure, but the damage had been done. Her laugh at Marcus, her dismissive attitude, her belief that he was guilty without question, those moments now seemed to echo in the courtroom, reminding everyone of how flawed her judgment had been. Marcus, on the other hand, felt a quiet sense of victory. He had stayed calm, and in doing so he had managed to expose the truth. He could see the judge's discomfort, and though he didn't take joy in her struggle, he knew that justice was being served. As the judge cleared her throat again, trying to shift the focus back to the case, Marcus didn't need to say anything more. The evidence had spoken for itself. The turning point had come, and now it was clear. The scales of justice were finally beginning to balance. The courtroom, which had been tense with uncertainty, now felt quieter, almost suspended in time. Everyone waited to see how Judge Taylor would handle the situation after the undeniable evidence had exposed the flaws in her judgment. The weight of the moment hung in the air like a cloud, and Marcus could feel the eyes of the courtroom on both him and the judge. It was as if everyone in that room, from the jury to the spectators, was holding their breath. Judge Taylor took a long, slow breath as she gathered herself, trying to maintain her composure. She straightened her robe, adjusted her glasses, and briefly glanced over at the prosecutor, who was still sitting with her arms crossed, appearing unsettled by the unexpected turn of events. The judge's eyes briefly met Marcus's, but she didn't speak right away. For a moment, the judge was silent, weighing her options. The arrogance that had characterized her earlier demeanor seemed to have vanished, replaced by something more fragile. She cleared her throat, avoiding eye contact with Marcus for a moment longer, and then, to the surprise of everyone in the room, she spoke. "Mr. Green," Judge Taylor said, her voice much softer than before. "I must admit I misjudged this case. The evidence you presented today has changed things, and it's clear that my earlier assumptions were wrong." She paused, and for the first time in the trial, there was a hint of humility in her voice. "I apologize for the way I treated you earlier. My actions were inappropriate, and I regret allowing my bias to cloud my judgment." The apology hung in the air, heavy with the weight of its rarity. In a courtroom, especially one presided over by a judge with as much authority as Judge Taylor, such an admission was unexpected. It wasn't common for a judge to publicly admit their mistakes, especially not when their reputation and authority were on the line. But in that moment, Judge Taylor chose to do something that very few would have done. She owned up to her error. The room, still in a state of disbelief, seemed to breathe again as the tension lifted. Marcus's heart slowed as he absorbed her words. He had not expected an apology, especially after everything she had put him through. But hearing her admit her mistake, even in a professional and somewhat formal way, gave him a sense of closure. He had been treated unfairly, but now the scales of justice had been reset. Judge Taylor continued, her voice a little more steady now. "The court will take the new evidence into consideration. I believe the charges against you, Mr. Green, are without merit, and I will ensure this case is dismissed accordingly." As she finished speaking, the atmosphere in the courtroom seemed to lighten. The prosecutor nodded, albeit reluctantly, and began to prepare to end the case. Marcus's lawyer stood and smiled, offering a firm handshake to his client. Marcus, still processing everything, stood up slowly, his legs a little shaky, but his resolve stronger than ever. He looked toward Judge Taylor, not with anger, but with a calm understanding. He nodded in acknowledgement, but he didn't say anything. The apology was enough. He knew that it wasn't just the judge's words that mattered. It was her actions. The decision to admit her fault and make things right was, in itself, a powerful statement. As the courtroom cleared and the case was formally dismissed, Marcus found himself walking out of the room with a feeling of relief. His name had been cleared, and he could finally go back to his life, free from the cloud of suspicion that had hung over him for so long. But there was something deeper in his heart, something that stayed with him long after the trial had ended. As the trial concluded and Marcus stepped outside into the fresh air, he couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. His journey had been filled with uncertainty, frustration, and moments where it felt like the truth might never come to light. But in the end, he had learned something important. First and foremost, Marcus realized that justice, while not always perfect, has the power to correct itself if the truth is allowed to come forward. It wasn't easy and it wasn't guaranteed, but the truth had found its way to the surface thanks to the evidence and his unwavering commitment to standing up for himself. In a world where people often feel unheard or invisible, Marcus's experience proved that speaking up and staying true to the facts was worth the struggle. But perhaps the most important lesson of all came from Judge Taylor. People, even those with power, are capable of mistakes, and it's essential to own up to those mistakes when they occur. Too often, authority figures, whether judges, politicians, or anyone in a position of power, are reluctant to admit they were wrong. But when someone has the humility to recognize their error and take responsibility for it, as Judge Taylor did, it creates a chance for healing and growth, not just for the person who made the mistake, but for the entire system. Marcus had been treated unfairly, but Judge Taylor had shown that acknowledging and correcting injustice was far more valuable than letting pride get in the way. Her apology, though late, sent a powerful message. It's never too late to do the right thing. In a world that often feels divided by biases, her willingness to admit her mistake showed that change is possible, even from the most unlikely places. As Marcus moved forward, he knew that life wasn't always fair, and that sometimes the system failed those who deserved justice, but he also knew that, like him, others could fight for their rights, and with enough persistence, find a way to be heard. In the end, justice had been served, not just because of the truth, but because of the courage to acknowledge when things were wrong and make them right. The lesson was clear. Never let the opinions of others define you, and always believe in the power of truth, humility, and fairness to restore what is just.